Hey everyone, it's Andrew. Welcome to Atomo. It is Tuesday, January 24th, and we have a lot of corruption to talk about. So let's get started here. We have tick tock, tick tock, tick tock, tick tock, tick tock, tick tock. Yeah. So the atomic clock has been updated. It is 90 seconds to midnight. And there's some information here on the bulletin.org, the bulletin of atomic scientists who created this clock. Back in, they say here, 1947. um, so yeah, I guess there is an understanding that the technologies that were developed for the Manhattan Project and the subsequent use of those technologies mean that, well, how far do we go before technological innovation gets ahead of us? As we create new technologies, it is possible, of course, as we know, we can use them for good or for bad. And when I was growing up, I grew up during the Cold War between the USA, Soviet Union, or NATO in the Warsaw Pact. Even here in Canada, we had air raid sirens set up in our cities. And sometimes they would go off, and usually we have to listen to the radio and they say, "Oh, well, we know the air raid sirens are going off, but it's false alarm or we're testing." Some people panic, but we just went about our day. If it's gonna happen, it's gonna happen. What are you gonna do? Hide under your table? Hide under your table when atomic ash is falling all around you? Yeah, we had the little get under the table drill and stuff like that. It's not going to do very much. Sure, do it. No, safety, safety. And I don't want anybody coming and saying, "Oh, I said not to do this." You know, do you? If it's going to save you some splinters from ceiling pieces falling down, then, well, at least you don't get splintered to death. But, fallout will get you anyhow. So just prolong it a bit, I guess. Anyhow, no medical advice, no legal advice. No, just take this for entertainment purposes. Um, who decides what time it is? So I guess they're saying here they have a board that meets twice a year to discuss world events and reset the clock as necessary. And the clock has been, when it's necessary to say reset, it just hasn't been at this time before at 90 seconds to midnight. When were the hands set furthest from midnight? 1991, the end of the Cold War. That's the fall of the Soviet Union, the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. And I sat down and watched this in front of the TV just to watch how, uh, I liked it back when Reagan was debating these, and I thought I actually found it, kid, I've actually found it quite entertaining, but I also was plugged into the fact that this could potentially be an existential crisis that knocks us all out. So we had it back at 17 minutes to midnight, uh, quite a while ago. Here's some, if we scroll back in time, 7 minutes to midnight, going to 63. I can't remember when Stalin died. Um, yeah, I can check that later. I thought, well, maybe if you have certain leaders that no longer exist, uh, that might help things out a bit. Um, yeah, and then back to the 1980s. We're in Cold War period time again. This was getting 84 was around the time of a recession. Now that's another thing to check as I'm looking at this. Is there an interplay between recession and when the clock gets set? Maybe perhaps not. because here's the 17 and 14. The 90s were a bit. There's a big one in 84, 81, 84. There's a big recession and slowdown. The early 90s there was a bit as well. Yeah, then look what happens over time as we think more and more. What they added was things like, let's see, went 2 minutes down to 2020. If we take a look at this statement here, look, they're adding climate change. This is where it gets, I think, a little bit hokey in there is the climate change. I'm not too worried about climate change, really. I think they do this just to appease the wokeness of climate change. You really have to worry about the nuclear weapons and the bombs dropping more than anything. And that's as we move forward, taking a look at our favorite friend Zelensky and shenanigans going on some more. There's been some cleanup in Ukraine, especially with some corrupt administrators. You're not really going to call them politicians because they don't really have free and fair and open elections ever since 2014, when they picked the wrong person and then the Obama regime knocked that person out with a coup backed by George Soros. A lot of information out there on that. And that's when Crimea was annexed over to the Russians. I don't even feel like calling it annexed. They voted on a referendum. And as much we poo-pooed saying, oh, it's illegitimate. Really, the collective West doesn't have a leg to stand on, because so many times they've bolstered illegitimate regimes and gave it a pat on the back when things went all well, against the democratic processes in these particular countries. So, if you want to shape the game board and then the game board starts shaping you, don't have a hairy conniption fit. But here's the thing. Chronic problem. Chronic is corruption. Corruption is very chronic. Ukraine is I guess very low in the corruption index in terms of a lot of corruption. Probably maybe it's in the 10th percentile of the most corrupt. Maybe even the 5th percentile of the most corrupt. So that's why a lot of things can happen, like alleged biolabs, gain of function research happening outside the purview of treaties and other elements. So some other updates to draw in on here is, the tanks are going over. So I believe there's 20 M1 Abram tanks that the USA was going to send. It was 20 or 40, something to that effect. It was only, which was like 4 tanks in a platoon. So if you have 40 tanks, that's 10 platoons. It's basically more of, let's create a science experiment, which I think is what's happening. Is we'll put some of the equipment into front lines, not enough to really trigger, if you wanted to put 3,000 tanks on the front line or 4,000 tanks on the front line, or whatever the totality of the stocks are of NATO, with USA going all in, that would be massively significant. Of course, you have to have the manpower and the logistics to do that. And here's where the corruption becomes a big problem. If there's money and supplies and material going over to the Ukraine, I think I'm done with this here. If you have money and supplies and material going over to the Ukraine, and if those materials are getting nicked, stolen, 5-finger discounted, five-finger procurement. We'll put a procurement order in, and we'll take this. We'll give this stuff to the troops. We'll actually take some of the food for ourselves. I was reading up on that as well. One of the food SARs, I'll call it the SAR, was dismissed as well. And it's almost like, well, you know, um, then they say some platitudes in a way. They go, what what's really happening is not all the stuff is getting over to the military. It's like, oh, do we have shortages in grocery stores, or are my family's getting shortages, or can I? Hey, I'm going to nick, I'm going to nick a few tons of supplies, move them into my warehouses, and then supply them to my buddy's stores for a particular markup and give me a kickback, and I'll bank that money. And then your armed forces don't get the provisions that they need. So of course their morale is not going to be high, and they're going to, when push comes to shove, they're just going to get trampled when a better supplied army comes in. So if we want to look at logistics, it's primarily logistics that do win armies. You do have to have a good solid front line. You have to have appropriate equipment and material. But if you can keep that equipment and material fed, then if your supply chain is more effective, especially after when you have engagements, and as the engagement unfolds and your unit cohesion starts to go down, you're using up ammunition, your units are starting to get scattered, and you have to use communication and techniques of, okay, if we're rolling on the enemy and we're fighting, and then some of my units are breaking a bit in formation, or they're taking opportunity measures, and my ground staff is doing that, then what happens is then my army might start to pull apart a bit. That makes logistics and supply more difficult and increases battlefield fog of war, communication, and complexity problems. And it has to be a point where, okay, we need to stop and bring units back, do some recohesion, resupply the units. If I can do that quickly and effectively, if my army logistics and management processes are of a high caliber, then after we do pushes and advances, we can reform quickly and build that unit cohesion back up, resupply people, material, and then get back into the fight. And that's one of the things that the German army did in World War II, is they figured out Germany was one of the smartest countries in the world at that time. So they figured out a lot of these. They were very good process managers and other thinkers that could figure this out, and actually built effective supply lines. Of course, what they didn't realize is the resolve of the enemy that they're fighting, especially when they went towards Stalin. But of course, Stalin also had the fear of, if you screw up, well, I'd rather get shot by the Germans than shot by the Soviets under the Stalin regime. Heaven forbid any Russians that were captured and put into a Western POW camp. The moment those soldiers came back and were traded back, they were thrown in prison because they got a taste of the way that the infidel Westerners lived. So as if corruption remains a big problem in Ukraine, then that means that they are basically already, they're disrupting their supply lines even before that gets to the front line. So Abram tanks are a different beast altogether. They're not as durable as in a supply sense. They're durable from a fighting sense, but if you have them supplied appropriately, then they're a pretty good unit to fight with. Again, that was, we're talking decades ago. And even though it is quite a capable platform, one of the things with the Abrams tank is it basically runs on non-diesel fuel, maybe jet fuel. I think it has a turbine engine in it. That makes it zip really fast. But that requires very specialized supply chain to get that sort of fuel. The tank worked well in the Gulf War when it was just based off of mop-up, where supreme air power went in, obliterated Iraqi lines, and then the tanks just came in and cleaned up the mess. targets were already softened. Here, you don't have the luxury of air support. There's significant amounts of air defense that are in play in the Ukrainian battlefield. That's why you also don't see Russian jets doing a lot of sorties, or you don't see Russian bombers going in and bombing out some of these positions. It's primarily artillery war at this point, just because the air defense systems have quite a bit of coverage, and they're quite effective air defense systems, even some of the old legacy systems. So those haven't been tested, but we might see, especially if older F-16 jets or other NATO jets are put into play, then what we may see is those jets doing sorties into Ukraine and kind of testing how the air defense systems operate on them before the more expensive jets are committed. So even these older, they're sending the older M1 tanks, not the M1A ones or the M1A2s or the MX. I don't think the MX is actually available yet, but it was showed off last year. So you put in some of the, so as they spent all of the old, Warsaw Pact and the 1950s and 60s equipment and burnt all that down. Now it looks like there's an escalation into the newer equipment. So maybe we're going to run the circa 1980s, 90s equipment through before we get into more of the turn of the century stuff. So just look at it as a testing ground at this point. The M1 tanks are the first version. So they haven't really been tested in a very honest battlefield. So that's to come. That means supply lines have to be fixed up. So it could be, and this is a thought, is that's why Zelensky, probably through some contractors and management specialists, perhaps have gone in. So that's something I'm looking for. So allegedly, some management group has gone in to take a look at what's going on, just to make sure that, if they're serious about doing things in Ukraine and actually making any sort of progress, the actual management processes of the way that the Ukrainian armed forces is getting supplied has to be rectified. If they're not, then you're basically any material that goes there is gone to waste. It won't be in battle ready condition. So that's something to look at. I'll end it here. Have a great Tuesday night or Wednesday, wherever you are in the timeline, and we'll see you in the next video.